Okay, guys, so our next speaker is going to be from Drew Martinez. He owns and operates Carnivorous in Texas. Like me, he's also grown carnivorous plants since he was 11 years old, so it's a long time. Also, he sat on the IUCN Carnivorous Plant Specialist Group and has seen many, many Nepenthes in the wild, most of them, I think. And we're going to pass the microphone over to Drew Martinez. And his talk is... I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong email. What was your talk again? Does cultivation undermine conservation? Here you go.
I think so. Everybody hear me? Okay. I am a member of the IUCN Carnivorous Plant Specialist Group, and the IUCN, they generally will do assessments based on the threat levels that species are under, and this is for both plants and animals. So if you see something listed as like critically endangered or vulnerable, often in publications, it's the IUCN group which generally are doing those assessments.
What do the letters stand for?
International Union Conservation Network. Okay, so I'm going to talk about something that's a pretty complex issue here, and I'm going to be trying to touch on, where does cultivation fit in conservation, and particularly when is it bad? There's a lot of positives that can come from having plants in cultivation. I'd say nearly everybody here probably grows carnivorous plants. It's really a source of passion for us. It brings us together for conferences like this. And I'm sure we've all seen plants cultivated, in various botanical gardens and other things. So, there's a lot of positives that can come from that. In addition, you get media attention, public awareness. Education of these plants, research, funding for people to go out in the field and learn more about these things. And then we have genetic depositories, like botanical gardens for times whenever, plants are under threat. But there are some negative things that come from people growing these plants. One of the worst is these plants being poached to the threat of extinction. We also see a lot of habitats being destructed because there's so much traffic going through, and overcollection of seed as well, which again is a poaching issue, and it can threaten populations. So I'm going to focus most on things that I think everybody can agree are bad things, right? So with social media being more commonly adopted, it is really easy to connect people in faraway places to people who have a lot of money to buy faraway things, right? And so we see right here, this is from eBay this week. This was on Monday. And we see, they might be a little small for you to see, but we see a lot of very endangered Nepenthes seeds being sold, and not just one or two pods. Like we're seeing, 20 to 50 pods sold at a time. So entire stalks are being harvested, and I keep an eye on this, and it seems like there may be some populations where every stalk that was produced for that entire year has been cut and is being sold. And then we see actually plants, like this one's a cut to order plant or shovel to order plant right here, where this person's taking an order for this plant. And this is pretty harrowing because whenever you go into the wild, you actually see the results of this now in some populations. There are some areas where you see every plant in the population being cut, or you just go find a lot of them have been dug up. And this isn't necessarily confined to these sellers from faraway places. There's also a network of people on the other side who are retailing these things. So there's growers, nurseries both in the U.S. and in Europe where I've seen this has been pretty rampant. Plants that are obviously taken from the wild. Now, like I mentioned, some populations are as small as 10 plants. You've got extremely threatened populations like Nepenthes clypeata, which are really nearly functionally extinct in the wild. I think some of our friends from Japan are going to talk about that later as well. I tried to dive into modeling what these fragile populations would look like from a population perspective, like how threatened they are and how many plants can actually be the tipping point to knock plants down to extinction. And it bit off a little more than I could chew, so I'm working on that. It's actually going to be full on publication, but there's a lot of things to consider here. Right now, I wanted to touch on some of the underlying drivers which might, evoke this bad behavior that we're seeing. Let's see, and I think one of the first ones is disregard for how fragile these populations are. Like you may see certain plants. There's a nursery that has maybe 50 of them or something, just sitting out there in trays, and then you might not realize that maybe there's 50 plants in an entire site in the wild. Let's see, there's a lot of misconception and misinformation out there. The thing that's particularly troubling is I have newcomers often come to me with some preconceived notions that they state as a matter of fact, right? Like, and I'll touch on a couple of those misconceptions. Let's see, the collector's mentality is ubiquitous, and then there are economic reasons as well. So here's something that I've always found really interesting. Right here, this is at my nursery. I have 4 Nepenthes hamadas, all with Baya Lemut heritage. I purchased all these plants in 2010. They're all about this size. Now, what I want to ask, poll of the audience. Who thinks this is a seed-grown plant, and who thinks this is a tissue-cultured plant? So show of hands, seed-grown. Okay, tissue culture. All right, looks like there's more people think tissue culture. Same, seed grown. Tissue cultured. Okay, about half and half. Seed grown. Tissue cultured. All right, about half and half. Same question. Okay, tissue cultured. And then seed grown, And here's the list. There's one of them that is seed grown here, and all the rest are tissue cultured. So you've got 2 different clones from Borneo Exotics, one from the Nepenthes nursery in Germany, Andres Susuba, and then this one is actually seed grown, from some wild collected seed. My point here is you can't really tell the difference, but there's a lot of people, the first question that they ask me when they're buying a plant is this seed grown or is this tissue cultured? It's a big deal, and in fact, it can raise the price of a plant, sometimes, 3 to 4 times what a tissue culture plant would be. And to me, this is a baffling thing, but, this information has been passed on that, seed grown plants are inherently better than tissue culture plants. And so, okay, here's a bunch of mathematical things that I think in my head all the time when I'm breeding plants. There's some, function or something of, a whole bunch of different variables that makes a plant really desirable to a collector, right? So, I have no idea what this is, and it probably varies from person to person, I have a merit function for what I, think might, make a plant desirable. It's a whole bunch of different variables. Maybe for Nepenthes, it's these, and there's a whole bunch of different weights given. And we'll call that the weights alpha subi, and then the variable is x subi or whatever. And so, this variability or this desirability function is kind of, added together, and at the end of the day, you get some distribution. And this distribution would represent, the plants from a given seed batch. So some are going to be really desirable, some are going to be less desirable. They're all going to kind of peak in the middle. Like you're going to have plants that are just kind of the average amount of desirability for, whatever is in that seed batch. And I put up a normal distribution here, just because, a lot of things end up being distributed like this, there's some math that says, whenever you add up a whole bunch of random factors, they end up kind of looking like distribution. That's why it's so common to see complex variables end up, in a distribution like this. Okay, so here are listed some of the pros and cons of tissue culture plants. Definite advantages of tissue culture are they grow faster than just seed-grown plants. You can mass produce identical clones. Let's see, it requires a lot less plant material to produce plants in tissue culture than it does, growing in the classical way, just through seed and cuttings. And for nurseries, there's a lot less CITES regulations whenever you ship plants via tissue culture versus shipping live material. Let's see, some of the cons are, a single contamination of a culture can completely take out that clone that you're propagating. And we have seen catastrophes in some nurseries that just lost, an entire species in their propagation stock just because a container got open when it shouldn't have been. Plants are really soft whenever they exit tissue culture. So if you have a plant that hasn't been properly hardened off by a nursery, it can succumb to non-ideal conditions pretty quickly. But if you harden it off, that's not the case. Let's see. There's concern over potential mutations in tissue culture, and this is another misconception that I think is brought up a lot, where the thought is that plants coming out of tissue culture will have been divided so many times, or the cultures exist for so long, that they would be mutants or some way not true to the species or type. Let's see, there's also concern that there's carryover effects from hormones. So, and all these negative things can lead to inherently weaker plants that are less vigorous than their seed-grown counterparts, and they've got an inability to make root systems because of hormones, and they've got these mutations that make them not true, and there's also accusations that tissue culture plants are sterile. Now, I don't know, I've grown a lot of plants. I've got, maybe 10,000 Nepenthes in my nursery alone, and I would say that these effects of tissue culture can be true, whenever you just take a random sampling of these tissue culture plants, but it's a very, very small minority, like maybe less than 2% of plants coming out. And with careful selection, this can be zero. If you just select clones that are strong and robust, you're not going to have these issues. So I put some responsibility to producers here, and would say that it's in the best interest of cultivation and probably for their business as well to select really vigorous clones and to call out bad ones, and then also to select clones that are true to the species description, if it's a species, or just true to the records that they're advertising. And we're already seeing this in some nurseries. Like recently, Borneo Exotics has started to cull a lot of these weaker clones out of their stocks and only produce the really strong ones. So for example, like Nepenthes singulana, Mira, spectabilis, I've got some plants that I've grown for like a decade that are like no bigger than when I received them. Maybe they started out like this and now maybe they're like that. Whereas I've got some other ones that, they've doubled in size in 6 months since I've got them. Okay, so another misconception that I think is out there is, let's see, in the search for true species, quote unquote, there seems to be a lot of communication out there that if a plant is not exactly like the plant that was published in the photograph that somebody found on the internet, that it's not the true species. It's really unfortunate. But let me explain. These Nepenthes habitats, they're generally very inaccessible. You're carrying a 50-pound pack with you, and up until a few years ago, until smartphones got good enough to be able to take decent pictures, you had to bring your camera gear with you if you wanted to take any picture. So, sometimes there'd be hundreds of plants in a population. I'm not going to drop my pack unpack everything and take pictures of a mediocre plant that I see in the population. By mediocre, I mean the average looking plant in the population. What I'm going to do is I'm going to find the nicest 2 or 3 looking ones, and I'm going to get my tripod out, and I'm going to take nice pictures of that one, right? There's this misconception out there that unless the plants look like those really superlative ones, it's not the real thing or whatever, or it's not the desirable thing. Yeah, just like I mentioned, there's an incredible amount of diversity in the field when you're out there and looking at these things. Let's see, there's also another misconception that the picture needs to look like that all the time. Say for Nepenthes, because like this is the photo that made it famous, right? And so I'm going to illustrate this right here. So this is a particularly nice Nepenthes platychila I grow. This is a lower picture, and here's an upper, and I would say that's one of the nicer ones I've ever seen. This is an early stage upper. Now it's getting a little older, and now here this is like late stage I call it, where that vine's about 6 feet tall. It's produced a basal. And most of the energy is going to the basal instead of the upper pictures. So here it looks, quite a bit less impressive, right? But here's an even more extreme example of this platychila. So here's one where the pictures are kind of at their prime, and then here's another one where there's almost no peristome at all. The leaves still exhibit, everything that would be considered accurate with the description. And the rest of the plant as well. But this one right here has been called a hybrid by a lot of people. I'm not sure how healthy that is from this perspective of conservation, because then people are always after, the mythical true plant. And it's producing a lot of pressure on wild populations, either getting poached plants in or getting poached seeds in with with the desire to get more plants that are, this superlative clone. So I would put some calls to action for people to read more descriptions. Instead of looking at a picture and say that's a true plant or not, actually read the botanical description to say, this is consistent with that description, so it's that species. And let's stop the hybrid McCarthyism. So you get on the forums and you see. A lot of people are very quick to call something a hybrid just by looking at a single photo. I would say let's use more precise language. Don't refer to true plants as the most superlative clones. Let's just call them very nice clones or superlative clones. We should understand that there's a lot of natural variability in the wild, that all the pictures that you might see on a form, might be the best 2 or 3 plants from a population when there's a much wider distribution, and that plants go through life cycles, and they may only produce that perfect looking picture, just a short span in its life. I think that this is also a problem for location-specific plants, and I haven't seen this as much in the US, but I hear it's particularly problematic in Europe, that people are very fanatical about getting Drosera from a certain location. And again, I would say that the photos are probably of specific superlative plants that are probably in the peak of their life cycle in terms of being attractive. I would say remember that there's a lot of interlocation variability, and in fact, the interlocation, within a population may be even more variable than from one population to another. Okay, so another aspect of that's driving kind of this bad behavior is scarcity. Right? Collectors want superlative clones. And some of the ways to get them are buying poached plants or playing the lottery with getting wild seed. And locals are, generally, complicit to this, high demand and subsequent prices. I mean, because a lot of them are in impoverished areas, especially in Southeast Asia. When I'm talking about Nepenthes, they're making $1 or $2 a day at their job, working in a field or something like that. So the concept of getting a few $100s for a plant, can, really boost up their family income. So, and to all these locals, this plant has been in their backyard all the time, It's just like, I grew up in Phoenix. There was a saguaro in my backyard, It was always just there to me until I realized, what a special thing that was. A lot of locals don't realize this. So I would put the responsibility on the buyer to understand the scarcity of these things. Okay, so what are alternatives, right? Like how do we move forward here, right? Other than me saying don't buy poached things, off the internet. Because, realistically, like that's not going to change our behavior. I think line breeding and hybridization really have a lot of potential here. And just like Peter alluded to earlier when he was talking about hybridizing things to really make them robust and beautiful and hardy. So I looked at parallels with the orchid world quite a bit whenever I'm thinking about where are carnivorous plants going, especially in the public view, and socially. So here's some photos from Veitch & Sons back in the late 1800s. They had greenhouses in the Nepenthes, just like they had greenhouses of orchids. Orchids definitely got a lot bigger than carnivorous plants, especially like starting in like the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and they became mass-produced in the 80s. Well, carnivorous plants has been more of a collector's hobby, but is really starting to pick up momentum. Whenever I start to analyze the marketplace in both the U.S. and globally, they're getting a lot more popular, they're a lot more publicized, and also the prices for very scarce plants is going up a lot. Well, if I look at an orchid parallel, Paphilopetalum rothschindlianum, which resides in Kinabalu National Park. Whenever it was first widely publicized, there were specimens that were getting over $25,000. But you take a look now, with orchid breeding, over the last decade, we see, this is a decade old, right? But this is some of the data I found. And we take a look at orchid judging from competitions. And we see that from 99 to 2009, we had huge improvements of what the best of the best was. You look at this chart and you see things are up, roughly like 25% over a decade. And that trend has continued to present day. And, it's getting to the point where you would get a plant that was wild collected, back whenever, people were paying $25,000 for a wild collected plant, and that thing would be obsolete now, compared to the greenhouses full of these things that are being produced. This one is actually produced at the Orchid Zone, which is not far away from here. Line breeding these things for generations and generations to the point where they're more robust than the wild counterparts, and they're more beautiful. So, can we do that with carnivorous plants? So, here is a local celebrity. This is Phil Felici's breeding work, and there's a Sarracenia flava on the left that he bred, and then there's a Sarracenia leucophila on the right. And then same's been done with fly traps, and we see some of Phil's hybrids in particular for Sarracenia that I've seen quite a few Sarracenia in the wild, and I would say I've never seen some Sarracenia as beautiful and robust as some of the plants that Phil is producing now out of his breeding program. Just phenomenal. So, again, he may, this trend may make, trying to get this wild material obsolete because we're taking the best plants we can, we're bringing them together, and just creating really beautiful hybrids, for Sarracenia, Nepenthes as well. Here's a Nepenthes bred by Sam Estes, which I think is just gorgeous. This is Nepenthes hamacuna. But we can do the same thing for species too. And so this is, a list of Nepenthes species that have been bred by various nurseries, in the U.S., Europe, and Asia. And there's by no means an exhaustive list. This is just what I could come up off the top of my head. I'm sure I missed some. But we're looking at, a large number of some of the most desirable species, being bred with, in nurseries. So, I think this future, is bright as we move forward, and I think as we get more and more generations in, you may see plants that we're a very picky highland growing plant or something, bred to be much more tolerant of conditions. So that's all I had on this. Any questions? Phil?
Is there any effort made, if you look at the slide you had showing the Australianum, notice one of the things that's in there, even though it is the species, each one of those improvements has a clonal name. Is there any real effort being put into doing that for carnivorous plants? So if you have a specific, if you look at those 4 plants that you had seed grown or otherwise, in the orchid world, each one of those, which was awarded, would get a clonal name. So you know if you got a piece of that plant, you got a piece of that plant. So as you make your improvements, people can say, oh, I have a piece of that improvement.
Yeah. Well, I'd imagine only, if something was published as a cultivar already, which is commonly done. It's strange to me, though, that, with some genera, cultivars are quite common. Like with Sarracenia, there's so many cultivars that we're running out of cultivar names for a lot of plants. But then, like, say with Nepenthes, there's very few cultivars that are being recently published. But I mean, that's a way, but I know with orchids, you name every plant that's judged, right? Not just the ones that are cultivars, correct? Or?
Well, you only have to name it if it's awarded.
Okay.
You can name it just because it's a communal thing, right? Or at least that's the kind of the social norm to do that.
A published name only really gets awarded in an orchid if you compete it and you get a certain level of award assigned by the American Orchid Society.
And I think part of the problem with these cultivars in general, and why you don't see more of those, is because, a cultivar isn't really supposed to just be like a feather in your cap, but like, I have this amazing plant, look, I'm the only one who has it. It should be able to enter the trade. And part of the problem is you can name it Nepenthes cultivar, but then getting that cultivar into trade more than like 2 cuttings a year for the rest of your life doesn't really happen. So with the orchids, I think they got that more practice part, but only that specific one for the culture.
well,
Yeah.
not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Yeah, you can get like a Carnivorous awarded and have a clonal name, but you never go into it.
Interesting. So that's totally it.
No, I mean, there's direct parallels, like with paphilopetalums, because you can't put those as meristomes into tissue culture either, just like Nepenthes. Andres?
Well, not a question, but an additional comment. Because one argument which is continuously brought up for people saying that we need wide-collected seeding cultivation to have genetic diversity ensured for conservation purposes. And this is nonsense. I think we have all to be sure, even if we collect 10 different or 300 different clones from one Sarracenia population, for example, that it's just a private collection, nothing more. It's our hobby collection. We do not protect the species from extinction in the wild because I see excedo-conservation very critical because it's just one of these charismatic plants that we protect, but not the surrounding environment, all the species interactions. For example, each species of Sarracenia has an exira moth, has a symbiotic mite. Who wants to have mites and these herbivores in the collection? All of these free for them. So even if we do this excedo-conservation, if the plants get extinct from wild, the ecosystem is non-functional anymore because all the interacting organisms, none of them can protect them. So we should be aware that we are not doing this for conservation purposes, collecting different clones, but we're doing this like collecting stamps. It's just a hobby, nothing more. So I think it's not an argument for having 5 wild poached seed to have genetic diversity. We could enjoy the same plants of having 5 or 6 different clones.
I don't know, I would say they might not be able to put the tigers back in the wild, but they keep the tigers around in zoos too, and although you're not conserving the natural environment, there is something to conserving a few parasitic species that everything's being wiped off the planet.
Well, we have to have lead species for the environment, but what we have to think about is we have to protect the environment. And anyone who's going there and removing seeds or seed stocks or plants.
I 100% agree with that.
There's a limit to what you can do, especially with climate change. You will see some local ecologies going, to be eradicated no matter what you do. And the question is, would you like to preserve something that you could potentially reintroduce in some
you want to reintroduce a plant to habitat where you have to go and hand pollinate it every time because nobody was thinking about protecting the natural pollinator or the interacting organisms. So it's just like putting it from your own garden and it's something which was formerly a habitat and is now a garden which has to be maintained. So I think we have to think on a larger scale, protect the habitats as fast as we can.
Yeah, I would agree with Andreas. I mean, if you take a look at global pressures for, and it depends on which genera we're talking about. Nepenthes are quite isolated, so maybe they're aside from climate change, they aren't really being threatened, for development. But something like Sarracenia, where we're just, we may have a lot of genetic material for reintroduction. So, those bogs and other areas where they're growing are just being completely depleted on a rapid scale for human development. So we may have the genetics in collections, but that really won't matter. Just like Andreas was saying, it's a whole ecosystem.
Drew, I think we have that in other places as well, though. It's not just the same kind of development we have here in the U.S. You still have areas that are being destroyed for palm oil production.
Of course, yeah, of course. Of course.
So, on your letter from the museum, what's CPS for?
Carnivorous Plant Specialist Group.
My question is there any active reintroduction into the wild?
Reintroduction into the wild?
I mean, they're taking it out. My husband and I,
No.
as well as growing carnivorous plants, are active orchid growers. In orchid conservation, they've got reserves out there that they're starting to build where they can go ahead and reintroduce into a protected area so that you can go ahead and reestablish colonies. Is there anything like that for carnivorous plants?
Well, see, I'm not sure. Actually, maybe we should take a straw poll because. Okay.
The Arc of Life is something too.
Atlanta and Meadowview is also doing it, so it is starting to happen.
Thank you.
Okay.
One of the problems is that usually the habitats are destroyed, they're drained, you can't reproduce.
And the other thing as far as like preserving ecosystems goes, and like I'm totally on the same board of like let's save as much of the world as we can and as much of the habitat as we can. But let's face it, Great Barrier Reef is dying, and like our plants need bioecology, our plants need all kinds of stuff, pure water, there can't be a farm next door. And frankly, like, a drought you can fence out with people, you can't fence out a drought. You can't fence out, the fire ecology breaking. You can't fence out all that stuff. And so, like, that's why I've devoted my entire life to putting as many of them into our project as we can. This is a sad situation for sure. And do I believe that, like, we're saving everything? We're not saving the pollinators, we're not saving the mice and all that? No, I don't. But, like, frankly, like, maybe in 200, 300 years from now, when we've all pieced it together and we try and build this world back together somehow, maybe we'll be glad that we have some stuff around and we're not all riding horseback and killing each other.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I wanted to give this talk here is because, I'm not sure how many resources we have, here as a community to fix these big issues, that are putting habitat pressure on carnivorous plants, but we definitely can influence, how we behave in terms of taking plants out of environments or seeds out of environments where there's very few of them left, especially the places they're isolated. I'm talking a lot to the collectors here.
So I noticed that a lot of this presentation seems to focus on plants that we already have a solid utilization. And I'm wondering what you think about how we should approach introducing new species to cultivation. And I'm not very well versed on the dependent side of things, but I remember back when Rothschild was being introduced, there were some concerns about like the nation's popularity of this plant being a factor for increasing the pressure to poach these plants from their native habitats.
You touched on it. It's definitely an economic situation, right? Whenever you have, you have high demand and, and scarcity, you're going to, drive up costs. So I'd say the best way to do it is to get it into to places where they can be mass produced and made widely available to to the public. Yeah, I mean, that's, I believe that truly, like, like I think Damon mentioned that as well. This mission of conservation through cultivation, that can help. I mean, I would say a big part of it is getting it into capable hands that have the resources to do that, right? One of the things I noticed, honestly, about this hobby, and maybe it's not as true of the audience here because, I see a lot of familiar faces that, from conferences, 20 years ago, but it's a pretty transitory hobby, in some sense. So the people that get really obsessed or really into collecting, you have somebody who starts, and then 5 years later has amassed a gigantic collection of very rare, very endangered plants, and then life happens, and they get married, or they go, they move to another state for a job, or they go to school or something like that, and those plants go away, right? So there's, and although they may thought they were doing ex situ conservation, by getting these plants originally, life happens, right? So there are places, botanical gardens, like large nurseries as well that I think have the resources, and the longevity to really be able to propagate these things and mass produce them and get them to other people's hands. Yeah.
Add about the Strasser segment really quick, but that was a really good example of how the discoverers immediately disseminated seeds to the right people, and there was a group formed so that we could all share from our knowledge to quickly learn how to grow it. And California Carnivorous, for instance, will have breed for sale today, and like next year we'll have lots and lots and lots and lots for sale. And that's one of the reasons that I think that cultivation really can help conservation, is because if you can buy one for me next year for not that much money, then why would you go dig it up?
Well, we're kind of talking about introducing plants into other protective bogs. But say you have a bog of Orophala and that gets wiped out, you save a bunch of seeds from that, and so you introduce it into another bog, but that plant's not native to that bog.
Yeah, I don't think that's a good idea.
Yeah, so I don't see how that helps.
I mean, invasives, carnivorous plants can be invasives as well. We see that in some areas, even in California.
Where do you see the role of tourism, even if it's not tourism for conservation? Because I see at least the potential for if people come specifically to locations to visit and see plants, that locals in that area realize that the plants might be more valuable to stay in that place rather than be overpoached or gone.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. There are some places where ecotourism has developed so much that it actually can prop up the general village or area. It's not just true of plants, but like for example, if you visit Papua, Papua has a very extensive birding network for people to go observe the birds of paradise. It's much more lucrative for the community to host visitors, for days and days of touring than to catch a bird of paradise and sell them in the black market. And I think that's also true of many carnivorous plants. It takes developing the ecostructure and educating them enough to be able to know how valuable they could be to the community in their natural state, not necessarily put in a box and shipped somewhere else. Yeah.
How do you think, or do you think there's any negative effect to having the plant's price drop really fast for the sellers, and not just in terms of obviously making less profit, but in terms of, let's say a plant that takes 5 years to mature, 3 years to mature, and you were selling it for $50, has more value to be like putting your time and money into conserving it than when it drops like $10 and you can sell 50 Capensis plants for the same price, and you didn't spend, let's say, 5 years keeping that plant under lights in a cool greenhouse. Do you think that would hurt, like, how many people are willing to keep it going, put that much effort into keeping it going, so once the values drop?
I mean, are you talking about, once the values drop, that people will stop keeping it going, or?
Yeah, or like is there any like statistics on that where like that it might be less valuable to be propagating and selling like the Ferro Regio when it's going to take you a couple of years to get one that's like sales size, so you could easily just sell Capensis with no effort.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think it all ends up being economics at the end of the day.
As cheap as it costs to produce it, and a nursery usually paying I spend 5 years making something, it's never going to be $8. That being said, like drawstring fence is actually rare in the wild. That's why it makes so many seeds, so it can survive drying conditions, and you don't see it too terribly often. We sell 10 million drawstring fences all the damn time, and they're all over everywhere, all over the whole world now. So I would say that dropping the price isn't necessarily lower interest or lower protection.
Is there any interest in developing a seed industry to put wild collected seed out of business? I mean, the reason seed is an issue is because it's small, mail, you get through customs without inspection and so on. You know, I talked to Rob Getway a couple of times about perhaps offering seed as a way of making sure you get a good quality seed that's fresh from a brand name, and put people out of business that are collecting wild seed by just offering enough of seed, perhaps even developed in this country where you don't have to break the laws to get it.
Yeah, that could be a possibility. I don't know. If you take a look at, this list right here, though, there's, let's see, there's a reason why rare plants stay rare, though, and often it's because the seeds are quite rare, to come by to begin with. That's, once you get into this case of, say like Nepenthes edwardsiana, for example, right? You're trying to distribute that. You can sell people a lot of seed, but ultimately, it's a really, it can be a really difficult plant to grow. So all those, for the most part, those seeds could be lost versus, having it go into a nursery where they can be grown out properly, and then they'll have a much better chance once they're hardened off.
And it takes years.
Takes years.
We brought seeds this year horticulturally. We made Rishlow-280 seeds horticulturally. Last year we made Vogel around spinner right now. But those are all plants that I've had for 15 years. And then they bloom at the same time as a male and female. We make bravada seeds, right? And I'm about to get like 10 pods. And I'm going to give those to Mike. He's going to make 10 million of them for all y'all. And that's way more important than selling $5 seed packet of 20 of those seeds to compete with the Indonesians. And the Indonesians can sell it cheap because they're going to get them out of the wild and it doesn't cost them anything to produce, and they're there all the time. But for me, it took me 15 years to make those bravada seeds. And am I going to sell them for $5 a piece? No, we're going to keep them. We're going to make that species more solid in cultivation by putting it in the culture and making a lot of them. Plus, honestly, I don't want to sell the seeds because then any of my competitors can then take that and put it into tissue culture too. And skip that 15 years of growing those two plants, get a male and a female. So there's that help as well.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Any more questions before we wrap it up?
Yeah.
I was wondering if you had a list of comprehensive organizations that are already kind of building inertia towards conservation, something that everybody here can plug into, even if just financially to support sort of a established concerted effort.
Let's see, nurseries you said, which are
just general conservation organizations, whether they be nurseries or nonprofits or what have you.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I don't have a list like that, but that's something we should put together. Yeah.
So organizations that are doing at least on the endangered Scarcity side, really the biggest one would be the Endangered Conservancy of Alabama. They do plenty of work with Scarcity alpinensis, Scarcity borealis, not really so much Jonesii. Meadowview is doing a lot of work with Jim, but they are actively going and collecting genetic material from these sites, growing out plenty of seedlings to safeguard some of this material from each individual site. And they are cooperating with the Fish and Wildlife Service as well as a couple of other conservation agencies. That would be the biggest help for endangered Scarcity in Alabama.
All right.
Last two questions.
Yeah, last two questions.
I'll back up what Noah said too. I'm from North Carolina, and Nature Conservancy is also doing a lot of work on specifically Jonesii. They're protecting a lot of sites, and a lot of the sites are you have to register and go in and before you see them. But they're also collecting and preserving those populations as well, at least in western North Carolina, the more rare species.
Oh,
Does the IUCN or the CPSG in any way interact with folks in developing nations on a local scale to deter, prevent collection?
Well, the IUCN does have influence. They are an international organization, so they can't directly tell any specific government what they should do. But a prime example of this was a prison that was being built in Thailand, where Nepenthes, it's the only site where Nepenthes suritensis grows, and so the IUCN actually had our patron David Attenborough get on the phone with some officials from the Thai government and halt the prison project until the plants could be properly, the site could be properly evaluated. They could gene bank and then take cuttings from the existing plants, and then they built a prison over it. But then the plants were reintroduced right next to it. So I mean that's one example of how the IUCN did have or the CPSG actually had a direct effect.